Hey there guys, gals, and non-binary pals, it's DMG and welcome back to Blitz. And today I'm going to be kicking off a new series called Advanced Selections. Now this is meant for the real nitty-gritty kinds of topics that may be kind of boring, but I think are important to understand the finer points of playing the game at a high level. So today what we are going to be discussing is the gun. I call this all about the gun. Now, a lot of people struggle with understanding that a good gun means a world of difference in the game, right? If you can't hit anything, you're not going to do damage. If you can't penetrate anything, you're not going to do damage, right? So it's important to have a good, reliable weapon by your side when you're playing. And people look at stats of tanks and take them as a one-dimensional kind of, this is the best in a certain category, and then that means that this is the best gun in the game. That's not true. I don't believe that for 1 second. Now, the gun is based on a lot of different things. You want something reliable. Now, what do I define as reliable? Reliable for me is decent DPM. It doesn't need to be the absolute highest. I mean, higher is always better, but it doesn't need to be the absolute highest. But it cannot be the worst either. If it's the worst, sometimes there just isn't enough you can shoot to get yourself out of a situation. It needs to have good penetration, because I don't care what tank you're in, sometimes you may need to pen frontally. And if you just don't have the penetration on your standard or your premium rounds, you're not going to go through. And I think on that note that 3.9 was one of the best changes to the game, as it reduced the damage on premium rounds and it put a premium on having good standard penetration. For example, the Tiger 2 compared to the what's another tier 8 heavy tank that has good terrible penetration. And I can't even say an IS3, but you know what I'm talking about, right? When I say having good standard penetration, it'd be like a better example is the E50 versus the T54, right? E50 has better standard penetration by almost 20 millimeters compared to the T54. But then once you hit the premium ammunition, once you dipped into your gold, you have 330 on your, or previously you had 330 millimeters on your heat for your T54 and only 270 on your APCR for your E50. Now, what that meant was that people would you only use heat, and then it doesn't really matter if you had poor AP because you could just go to heat. But now that that's changed, I think it brought a lot of tanks that had good standard penetration, and it made armor a lot more relevant too. So I'm all for that. Anyways, so my point is having good penetration is important to be able to actually use your DPM. There's this whole theory called effective DPM, and there's a lot of different speculations on how this works. People say that effective DPM matters on penetration. That's true. If you're getting the flanks, your effective DPM is pretty much maxed out, because you'll always be able to get shots on weakly armored sides, right? Unless you're shooting at an angled mouse, or one that's starting to angle, right? But this effective DPM will always be more effective if you have more penetration. You'll feel more confident about making shots. Now, a few other things that go into this, I would say, are aim time, dispersion, and bloom. We're going to talk more about those later. Oh, and shell velocity is pretty important too, but we're going to talk about all of these. Now you're going to say, what's the most important stat? Or like, how would you rank them? How would you rank the stats, right? Okay, well, I'd put them in order of, let's see, penetration is first and foremost, DPM, bloom, dispersion and aim time, maybe they're tied for the bottom slot. Oh, and actually, okay, I put shell velocity above the dispersion and aim time, but below bloom. So it would go penetration, DPM, bloom, shell velocity, and then normal dispersion / aim time tied for last. And you're thinking, why does this matter? You know, why is this even important to me? Well, when you're trying to choose a tank and you're wondering about which gun to use, or why you're not penetrating shots, or why you continually have low damage games, it could be because your gun just is not very high performing. Even if it is doing 960 alpha damage per HE round, and you all know what tank I'm talking about, just because something has massive alpha on its HE at tier 6 does not necessarily mean it is the most effective gun. That is my small rant for this episode. Anyway, let's go into this. Now, to illustrate my first point, let's look at the T54 and Leopard PTA. Oh, actually, this would be a better example. Yeah, T54 and Leopard PTA. So if we look at the T54, where are you? And then we look at the Leopard PTA. So you can see their DPMs are marginally different. If you actually look at their reload, it's a difference between, well, it's actually a somewhat significant reload difference, but that's compensated by an alpha difference of 40. And you can see that the Leopard PTA has 54 millimeters more penetration than the T54. That's a lot of 54 in one sentence, but regardless, the Leopard PTA can penetrate almost anything on its standard, but consider that this was before 3.9. They'd both have 330 on their heat, so then it wouldn't matter. You just use heat anyway. So you'd have all these other characteristics like the DPM and the armor and the decent mobility that the T54 had, and just absolutely bully Leo PTAs, because even if they could keep up with you in DPM, God forbid they bounce one shot on your Russian bias armor, right? Now, another thing I'd like to illustrate is aim time, dispersion, and bloom. I think this is where people get really confused as to how to decide about guns in terms of what's a good tank that has a good gun. People throw around that term good gun. It's a good gun platform, you know, stuff like that. But what does that really mean? And I think one of the most important stats is bloom. Honestly, it's bloom. It's not a listed stat on the in-game files, but you'll be able to find it here in BlitzStars. If you don't know what this site is, please look at this highlighted text right here. Copy that into your search bar and look it up. I highly recommend you use this as it helps you just learn raw stats of tanks. And honestly, having this kind of information available to you in-game just gives you a better idea of how to engage and what your strengths are versus another tank that you're matched up against. So if I look at the... Well, let's look at bloom. I'm getting quite ahead of myself, aren't I? And I may not even be making a lot of sense. So let's look at the IS-8 and the T43. That's not the T43. This is the T43. Now, good guns. And first of all, this is ridiculous that the T43 has higher DPM than the IS-8. It's a tier 7 medium against a tier 9 heavy. Isn't that quite ridiculous? But let's not pay attention to DPM. Let's look at this stat right here. Dispersion on movement / rotation. So movement and then rotation. For the T43, movement and rotation. Why is this important? This is important because every time you move or you turn your turret, your reticle will get bigger. Now, the lower this number is, the less your reticle will be big. Throw on a vertical stabilizer, and this number even goes down more. Let's see that in action. Boom, vertical stabilizer. Boom, vertical stabilizer. Dispersion upon movement has changed from 0.15 to 0.13, and has changed from 0.12, I believe, to 0.1. Now, if we take both of those off, the smaller your reticle is, the better. Now, a lot of people get hung up about having the best aim time, the best dispersion, right? They look at the in-game stats for the tank, And that's all well and good. But keep in mind that that is when you are fully aimed. And let's think about what it means to be fully aimed. That means your tank is stationary. Now, when your tank is stationary, obviously it means it's not moving. And when your tank is not moving, that means it could be vulnerable to get hit. Now, I'm going to ask you guys a question. When something pokes over a ridge and shows its turret, would you be more comfortable shooting at the turret if the target was stationary after it poked, or if it kept rolling back and forth? And you see me do this in almost, not in almost, you see me do this in every single stream and video that I post. You see me rocking back and forth. And it keeps changing, even slightly, my aim time, not my aim time, my bloom, the size of my reticle. So the smaller that is, the less you need to aim and the less you need to worry about missing your target because your reticle was too big. This also helps when you're being offensive too and you're taking the fight to the enemy. If you are sitting there and trying to shoot them, they're more likely than not going to pen you. But if you're moving, trying to dance around them, it's going to be really difficult for them to hit you, or just more difficult. It may take them a few extra seconds even after they've reloaded their shell to get their shot off and penetrate you, whereas you can just keep going and firing because you have such a small reticle. Now, going back to aim time and dispersion, that dispersion is only valid, or I mean it's still, that dispersion number is only valid when you are fully stopped and aimed in. Given aim times, for larger guns have, 3 seconds? 4 seconds sometimes? That's not too good. You don't want to be stationary for 4 seconds without moving your hull, or at least rocking back and forth, right? Because then you just become an easy target to hit. Unless you're sitting in camouflage, but that's a different story, right? But if you're hull down on a ridge, and keep in mind that hull down is the most important, most basic, most effective thing that you can do in the game to win yourself games. So this all bases off of hull down. If you can get in a protected position and fire away while moving back and forth over a ridgeline, bloom matters. And at least for me, this is my play style, because if I can go out there with minimal exposure and do damage to avoid tunnel, I will. And that's why tanks like the KV-2, 183, even the Jagdpanzer E100 now are just a little bit difficult for me to play, as everyone wants to tunnel, and it is hard for me to get into a protected position and expose and aim for a long time without taking any damage. Do you see what I mean? Now, the important thing you need to know here is that bloom is important. Isn't that redundant? But regardless, you want this number to be as small as possible. So before you purchase a tank, and if a priority for you is good gun handling, bloom is one of your most important stats. Now, let's compare this to other tanks, right? Let's take the IS-8 versus another Tier 9 heavy. I don't know. The ST-1, right? They're both Russian. Let's look at this difference between bloom. So if the IS-8 is moving or turning its turret to re-engage a target, or if it's moving back and forth across a ridgeline, trying to shoot at a stationary target, because a lot of people, if you're moving, they'll try and stop and shoot you, but if you can keep moving and keep your reticle on them, that's really good. So if you have 0.15, this is a lot easier to do than if you're in an ST1, you have 0.25. That is what? 66% more dispersion of the original value? That's a lot. You don't want to have 0.25 dispersion. And that's not to say that the ST1 is a bad tank, because it is a very good tank. But if you're looking to have a priority on good weaponry, the ST1 is not your thing. Granted, both of them have the same dispersion and have the same aim time, but this is why the IS-8 has a much better gun. It's not because it aims quicker or it has less dispersion. It's not any more accurate than the ST1 is, but it's bloom when it's moving. And keep in mind, you're moving a lot in the game. Any action you're going to take, whether it requires engaging a target, moving away from a target. A lot of people like to back up after they fire. A lot of people poke around a corner when they fire, right? You're going to be moving when you fire. Something about your tank is going to be moving. It's not sit there like a Revolutionary War style combat where you all get in lines of 7 and fire at each other until the other side loses all the HP. It doesn't work like that. This is why bloom is so important. Now, to show this in the T43 scenario, and I'm really trying to hit this home just to show how important bloom is. Let's look at the T43. And let's look at the T43 and let's compare it to, let's say, the Comet. I don't even know what this is. Even this is a big difference. And I'll tell you what, 0.12 versus 0.15, and you're thinking 0.15 is not bad for a Comet. But if you've ever driven both of these tanks and you're driving, notice that the T43 reticle is so much smaller, and every time you see a target, you just feel comfortable pressing that fire button, knowing that the shot will fly to target. And granted, your dispersion will be worse if you're not fully aimed in, but it's about having that reticle small to make the shots that you need to. Having the reticle smaller in the first place is the most important thing, because if you're going to stay stationary and aim, that means you're vulnerable. So aim time and dispersion, normally, this normal dispersion right here, it's not as important as you think it is. Aim time it may be a little bit more important than dispersion, but this isn't so much of a factor as people think it is. Let's go over something else important. Shell velocity. Let's think about tanks that have poor shell velocity. I can think of one. SP1C. Look at how atrocious this is. 630. And granted, while I think the SP1C can be an effective tank, let's look at another Tier 7 light tank. The LT. No, let's not. Let's look at the Type 62. This is only a, 150, roughly about that, shell velocity difference. And you're thinking that's not that much. But have you ever noticed when you're driving an SP1C that you can probably throw a baseball or pitch a baseball with your left arm faster than you can fire a shot in your SP1C and guide it to the target? This is a problem. If you don't have the shell velocity to hit things, you will have so much trouble in not only hitting the target, but penetrating. Those are two different things, mind you. Now, if your target is at distance and they are moving, I want my shot to connect at the right time. Sometimes I'm firing in very small time windows where it requires precision intervals for me to hit. You know, I can't spend forever on target, you know, watching. I mean, technically you shouldn't be watching your shot go to target, but if your shot misses simply because your shell misses the tank as they drive behind a building, you know, it would have hit if your shell velocity was faster, but they get behind cover for some reason, that is wasted DPM. You've essentially lost a shot in your DPM. And if we actually compare that real quick, and I'll go back to this example, but let's say if we look at the difference between a Leopard 1 and this is kind of a bad example now, but not a T62, but let's just say a T54. Or let's look at the Leopard PTA and the T54 again. This has 1,478 versus 950. This is a very stark difference. Now, this is not the frickin'. Actually, you know what? We can still use this. Although this is not the T54, this is the WZ-120. You know, those Russian or Chinese knockoffs for Russian tanks. But regardless, you can still see the difference here. While there is a DPM difference already, right? And it does 400 alpha. If you miss one shot in this WZ-120, your DPM goes down to what? 1975. If you're engaging a target and you miss one shot, this Leo PTA is going to kill you. I don't even care if he has no armor, right? If you can't even hit the target, the Leopard PTA has the strongest armor in the game. that's kind of odd to think about, right? But that's what happens. If you can't even connect to the target, then it could have tissue box armor. It could be a grill or a waffle tractor. It's going to have strong armor because you're never going to hit the thing, right? And that's why, Leopard PTAs and Leo 1s, the phrase goes around that speed is armor, right? Because if you can never hit them, it's never a problem. But going back to the Type 62 and SP1C. Now, the Type 62 has a higher shell velocity than the SP1C. This allows you to connect shots better at distance. And what this also means is that you will lose less penetration over distance. Because as a shell flies across the virtual map, it loses penetration the longer it travels. And this applies to AP and APCR only, which is going to be most frequently your standard and premium rounds in most cases. So if you already have horrid shell velocity and you're firing at a target from distance, which usually means that you're safe to not get hit back, it's going to suck if you miss your shot and they find out where you are because you missed your shot. Sometimes that changes games. Someone's a 2-shot, and because you bounced your shot on the enemy, they can come and kill you, and they know exactly in what direction you are. That is very scary. But if you have something with higher shell velocity, it's getting to the target quicker in less time, which means less lead on a moving target. It's losing less penetration over distance, making it easier for you to consistently do damage. And that is what is so important, is consistency. Bloom and consistency. If you can always penetrate the target, you are in such a good state, because no matter what the enemy does, you're always going to be able to penetrate them. Imagine having that kind of control over an enemy, knowing that whatever they do, you will not miss. Having high shell velocity helps you not miss, and that is why it's important. So stats that are not listed, bloom and shell velocity in the game files, are more important to me than dispersion and aim time. Now granted, having good dispersion, having good aim time is important, but I would say it's not as important as shell velocity or bloom. So at least they have to have respectable aim time and dispersion. Now let's look at another case. A lot of people talk about the E50M having great gun handling. You are wrong. But then if you compare it to its Tier 10 cousin, the Leopard 1, you will see large differences. Let's look at bloom. This is quite sad. 0.14 versus 0.1. That's not good at Tier 10. And while the Leopard 1 has noticeably better bloom, the E50M has the armor and the dispersion. But why does the E50M feel poor? And yeah, okay, yes, both of them have the same shell velocity, but this is why the E50M's gun doesn't feel as strong as the Leopard's. You see people complaining about the E50M not having a good gun, and this is why. It's because of bloom. It's not because of any stated accuracy difference or aim time difference. And granted, I mean, I feel the Leopard does aim faster than the E50M, and it turns out to be true here, but it's all about bloom. And this is why the E50M has to stop and aim for its gun to have this lovely 0.27 dispersion, whereas the Leopard 1, you don't even really need to stop. You can fire on the move, and it's basically a laser pointer. This is why it's so important to have good bloom. But at least when the E50M is in position, compared to, let's find a Tier 10 medium, the WZ121, it can easily hit its targets at distance because it has the shell velocity. Now, if you didn't hear me again, you're saying, well, Dark, the WZ121 has less than a second of aim time. That's good, right? No, that's not good. And I'll tell you why. Between 1.9 and 0.91, it doesn't matter. I'll tell you because the WZ121, and I did not script this, but it has literally double the bloom of the E50M. And you thought the E50M was bad, the WZ121 has double that. That's awful. And it has worse dispersion, so even when you're aimed in fully, you may not even hit the target. But this is why it's so good to have good bloom, because when you're trying to hit something on the move in the WZ121, like if you start rolling back as you as you press the fire button, your bloom is going to skyrocket. But as with the E50M, if you start moving, granted it's not like a Leopard 1, but it's not awful like a WZ121, right? Do you see where I'm coming from with this? It's all about the gun. Like, it's a bloom, shell velocity, right? And if you start moving, or if they start moving, if you're at distance, it's going to be hard to hit a bat chat with 1,000, right? It's not so hard to hit it at 1478. Shell velocity and bloom are what make a gun feel snappy. Aim time is not as important as you think. And this is why the Indian Panzer, and here's another example, the Indian Panzer is so good. Because yes, this tank used to have atrocious aim time, but it had good dispersion, and it had okay bloom, right? 0.16 is nothing to write home about. But the gun was still manageable because it had 0.6 bloom, even though it had aim time over 3 seconds before it got buffed. But it was still manageable because you had 0.16 on your bloom. And people used to complain about the Indian Panzer taking forever to aim. And that's true. But the reticle was already small enough to the point where aiming wasn't necessary. I'd rather have the reticle be small enough in the first place than stop and aim, right? I'd rather have it be small all the time as compared to having it stop, or having the vehicle stop, be exposed, maybe get HE'd, take any form of damage whatsoever, and then be able to fire, right? Let's not stop. Right? I'd rather not stop if I had the choice. I'd rather just be able to move back and forth on a ridge and just keep firing. That's why I like the STB, the Patton, tanks of that nature. Now, as I think of it, I'm not sure if I want to talk about gun depression, but since this is all about the gun and the word gun is in the term gun depression, I will talk about gun depression. Gun depression is another very important stat. Now, people always say more gun depression is better, right? Personally, I don't think you need more than 12 degrees. If you have over 12 degrees of gun depression, you're not really going to use all that gun depression because the terrain in Blitz that you're going to be... Blitz, let me preface this. Blitz is becoming flatter in the sense that maps keep getting flattened out. This has happened before with, what was it? Oasis Palms, Desert Sands. I can name a few others, I think. Has Himmelsdorf been changed? I don't even remember. Copperfield maybe got changed. Falls Creek got changed, right? But you can see that there's only so much gun depression is going to help you. You can see this with a lot of lower tier tanks that have 15 to 20 degrees of gun depression. You don't even need all of that. You might as well just have more DPM at that point, because for the hills that you're going to be poking over, you don't need to shoot them right under the hill. And if you are, you're only going to see their turret. But for the best haul down positions, I find that you can get away easily with 10 to 12. You don't want to have less than 5. That is my rule. If you have less than 5, that's not good. 5 degrees of gun depression gets you the bare minimum that you need. You want somewhere in between 5 and 12, and that is most tanks. You just want to stay away from the minus 20 degrees of gun depression, because if they have that, that's great, but then most likely they're going to be lacking in, or grossly lacking in some other category. And if you don't have enough gun depression, you will find it hard to get your shots off. Let's think about the 121 before it got buffed. It had what? It had 5. Even if that was really hard to use. Think about the I believe it's the SU-122-54. I think it has 4 degrees of gun depression. Or the SU-101 or the SU-100M1 or the Object 263. They have 5 degrees of gun, or 4 degrees of gun depression. Some of them have 3 degrees of gun depression. It makes your DPM really hard to use. Because if you can't even get a shot on them, your penetration is useless. Your DPM is useless. Because think about it, DPM, these DPM numbers, let's look at an E100 and a mouse, right? In order for you to be effective, in order for the mouse to have more DPM than the E100, and this is why I still think the E100 is a better tank than the mouse. In order for this mouse's DPM to beat this E100, it needs to be firing every 10.95 seconds, or in this case, I think it would show as 11 on the screen, and then 15.6 for the E100. So in order for the E100 to achieve 2465 DPM, it needs to be firing on the reload every single time. Same thing with the mouse. But you don't always get the chance to do that, guys. It's not so cut and dried. You know, if you're in an Object 140, right, and this tank is always about DPM. Where's the Object 140? If you're in an Object 140, it has this monstrous 3,591 DPM, and its reload is in 5.2 seconds. But unless you're pressing the fire button every 5.2 seconds, you're not getting this 3,591 DPM. I'm being very serious when I say you need to be firing every time the shell is loaded, and if you're not getting that, the DPM isn't as good. You might as well, you know, have a longer reload for some extra alpha, because what's DPM doing for you every moment you're not firing the gun? It's not doing anything. And this is why having good gun depression and various good other characteristics to help complement DPM is important. Like I said, you don't need to have the highest DPM. And while tanks like the Comet are lovely, sometimes it can be a struggle to use a massive 2,849 DPM because you don't have the best penetration. You don't have the best bloom. You don't have the best, I mean, granted, that's not important. And granted, you do have great gun depression. And that's why the Comet works. It's because you have gun depression and DPM. But sometimes it can be very difficult if you're not skilled at hitting weak points frontally with AP. You know, using the Comet could be really hard. Let's look at what's the other one? The other big one at this tier that has crap loads of DPM. Where's the Nomad? T23E3. There it is. Same DPM, only 2 millimeters more penetration. And yes, it has better shell velocity. It has the same bloom. It has a little bit less gun depression. But this is why the T23E3 is good, because it has the shell velocity and good bloom. And sure, it trades a little bit of gun depression for this extra shell velocity. But hey, it still performs well, because at least it has something to help complement this DPM. You can't just have raw DPM and expect to win. It doesn't work like that. Unless you're fighting leopard to leopard. But that's one tank matchup, and it happens in a very niche situation. So the point of this video was to help you learn about the gun. I hope I've cleared up some questions for you about what is the most important and what you should be looking for in terms when you're selecting tanks or making your own decisions on what you believe to be the most important, even for yourself, or what you perceive to be a good tank because you want the kill stuff, right? So if you enjoyed that content, please hit that like button and subscribe. And if you didn't, please leave your constructive criticism in the comment section. As always, I appreciate the opportunity to share my passion with you today, and I hope to see you next time.